In 4 hours, the Ashcombe Grand would either be restored or reduced to rubble by the following spring, and the 72 people in this ballroom arguing over shrimp cocktail had no idea they were standing inside the deciding vote. Julian didn't know it either. He just knew he needed this demolition contract to close by Friday, and that his ex-wife, standing by the dessert table in a cream blazer, still looked like someone he could talk down to. The condemnation notice was still bolted to the front doors when Simone arrived. 3 strips of yellow tape crossed over the brass handles like a wound someone had tried to bandage and given up on. She ducked under it without ceremony. This was the part of the job nobody photographed for the firm's website: the flashlight, the dust mask hanging loose around her neck, the clipboard already smudged with fingerprints before she'd written a single note. Inside, the Ashcombe Grand smelled like standing water and old varnish. Her boots left prints in a fine layer of plaster grit that had sifted down from the ceiling medallions over years of nobody looking up. A pigeon startled somewhere in the rafters, wings clattering against a stained glass skylight that hadn't let in real light in a decade. She ran a hand along the ballroom's east wall, feeling for the give that meant water damage instead of just age. The marble baseboard was cool under her palm, cracked in a long diagonal fracture that spidered up almost to shoulder height. Structural, not cosmetic. She made a note. Then she stepped back, and the space did what it always did to her, which was widen suddenly, the way a held breath widens when you finally let it go. She had danced in this room once. 17 years old, in a dress her mother had taken in twice because they couldn't afford new. The chandeliers had worked then. The parquet floor beneath the grit had gleamed under 300 pairs of shoes. Simone did not let herself stand in that memory long. She had learned, over 9 years of doing this work, that a building would tell you what it needed if you stopped narrating your own history over it. "Structural integrity's better than the demo report claims," she said aloud, mostly for the recorder clipped to her collar. "Floor joists show wear but not rot. Recommend full survey before any." Her voice caught on the far wall, where a brass plaque had been mounted decades ago and never removed. Class of dedication. Names she recognized. One she didn't need to read to know it was there. She didn't look for it. She made herself not look for it. Instead, she photographed the crack in the marble, logged the water stain blooming across the ceiling like a continent taking shape, and noted, in careful shorthand, that this building could still be saved if someone with actual patience got to it before the wrecking crews did. She had no idea the reunion committee had already booked the room for one final event before the vote closed. No idea whose name was on the caterer's contract 2 floors below her, negotiating terms with the same charm he'd once used to explain why her engineering textbooks were cluttering. His side of the closet. 2 floors below the ballroom Simone had just finished surveying, Julian Marsh sat across a folding table from a city contracts officer and tried not to look like a man who needed this deal more than he needed air. The banquet office smelled like burnt coffee and toner. A space heater hummed in the corner, doing little against the draft that came through the window seams. Julian had worn his good suit for this meeting, the navy one, tailored, the one that photographed well for investor decks, but the collar had started to feel tight around 11 that morning and hadn't loosened since. "The demolition timeline is aggressive," the contracts officer said, flipping through a stack of paper without much interest. "Your firm's proposing full teardown and site clearance in 11 weeks. 11 weeks is doable," Julian said. "We've done faster." That wasn't strictly true. What was true sat in a spreadsheet on his laptop. When he'd looked at so many times, the numbers had stopped meaning anything and started just feeling like weight. Marsh Development owed 4 different lenders a combined $9 million, and 2 of them had already sent letters using words like default and acceleration clause. The Ashcombe demolition contract, if it closed, would release enough in city fees and salvage rights to cover the worst of it. If it didn't close, Julian was going to spend the next year explaining to his father-in-law why the company bearing the family name was being dismantled in bankruptcy court instead of a wrecking site. He hadn't told his wife any of this. Avani thought the tightness in his jaw lately was stress about the reunion, about seeing old classmates, about nothing in particular. It was easier to let her think that. "There's a competing bid," the officer said, almost as an afterthought, sliding a folder half an inch across the table. "Restoration proposal. Came in late, but it's being reviewed alongside yours." Julian didn't reach for the folder. Restoration bids never clear the numbers. Nobody's going to pour that kind of money into a building that's one bad winter from collapsing. Someone apparently thinks otherwise. "Do you have a name?" "Not one I can share before the vote." The officer closed the folder again, unbothered. "You'll know Friday, same as everyone else." Friday, 4 days from the reunion, 6 from the deadline on his second lender's patience. Julian nodded like the timeline didn't matter, gathered his papers with hands that were steadier than his stomach, and thanked the officer for her time. Upstairs, muffled through the floor, he could hear the faint scrape of a chair being dragged across old parquet. Someone still working in the ballroom, hours before anyone else was supposed to be in the building. He didn't think anything of it. He had a demolition to close, a wife to reassure, and a reunion to survive. He had no idea whose footsteps those were. 9 years before the divorce, and 19 years before either of them stood in the Ashcombe Grand as strangers with lawyers. Simone had stood in that same ballroom in a dress her mother let out at the seams, watching light break apart across the ceiling through a chandelier she hadn't yet learned the word for. "Bohemian crystal," she'd said, mostly to herself. "Late 20s, probably. Look how the light refracts through the lower tier differently than the top. That's 2 different glass batches, added at different times." Julian had laughed, not unkindly, but not quite kindly either. "You're 17. Nobody cares about chandelier glass." "I care. That's what I mean." He'd pulled her closer on the dance floor, his hand warm against the small of her back, his chin resting easy against her hair like the conversation was already finished. "You've got this whole head full of joists and load-bearing walls and glass batches, and none of it's going to matter once we're out of here." She remembered the floor beneath them, the parquet gleaming and unscarred, nothing like the water-stained wreck she'd survey decades later with a flashlight and a clipboard. She remembered the band playing something slow and a little flat, the trumpet player missing the same note twice. "I want to build things," she told him. "Or fix them, I don't know which yet, maybe both." "You want to be an engineer." He'd said it the way people said words that didn't fit the person standing in front of them. "That's fine. That's a hobby, though, right? Something you do until..." Until what? He hadn't answered directly. He'd spun her instead, a practiced turn that made her laugh despite herself. And by the time she'd caught her breath, the question had dissolved into the noise of the room, into corsages wilting in the heat, into someone's aunt crying happily near the punch bowl because her daughter looked so grown up. Simone let it go that night. She let it go 100 nights after that, small moments where he'd smiled at her sketches of cantilevers and joint reinforcements like they were doodles, where he'd introduced her at parties as smart, she likes buildings, in a tone that made the sentence sound like an apology. She hadn't understood yet that a marriage could erode the same way a structure did, not in one dramatic collapse, but in small deferred maintenance, a crack here left unaddressed, a stress point there quietly accepted as just the way things were. The chandelier above them that night had held. It was still holding, technically, when she inspected it decades later with her flashlight, dust thick on every crystal, 3 bulbs burned dead and never replaced. She hadn't thought of that dance in years. Standing in the condemned ballroom weeks before the reunion, running her hand along the same crack in the marble, she wondered, unbidden, whether he'd remember the trumpet player missing that note. She hoped, briefly and without meaning to, that he would. The Ashcombe Grand had been dressed up for one more night before its fate was decided. String lights threaded through the same chandeliers Simone had catalogued weeks earlier, the water stain on the ceiling mercifully lost in shadow. The band was live this time, not a recording, and the bass line thudded up through the parquet into the soles of her shoes as she stood near the dessert table, phone angled low against her palm. Julian was working the far side of the room like a man running out of clock, because he was. She watched him find Ivani a chair near the bar, kiss her temple, and move off alone, practiced, efficient, the same choreography he'd once used at his father's fundraisers. He found Denise Acaffer first, now deputy director of the city planning office, laughing too loud at something before he'd even finished the joke. "Denise, you're still on the review board, right?" "Advisory capacity. Why do I feel a pitch coming?" "No pitch." He smiled the smile that had once made Simone believe every promise underneath it. "Just, the Ashcombe votes Friday. I've got crews standing by, city fees already structured favorably. It's a good deal for everyone." "I don't sit on that specific committee anymore, Julian." "Sure, but you know people who do." Denise's smile thinned into something more careful. "Everyone knows people who do. That's not really how it's supposed to work." He laughed it off, moved on before the rejection could fully land, and found Marcus Webb near the bar. A contractor Julian had done 2 smaller jobs with, easier company, less inclined to ask questions he didn't want answered. Simone caught fragments of it between the DJ's transitions. 11-week timeline, salvage rights, a phrase about getting ahead of the paperwork that made her jaw tighten, though she kept her face arranged into pleasant neutrality. Her phone buzzed against her palm, screen dimmed low. "Bid status. Final review, estimated decision Friday, 11:00 p.m. No change from yesterday. She'd checked 4 times since arriving, each time telling herself it would be the last, each time failing to keep that promise. The portal gave her nothing new, no rejection, no approval, just the same patient gray banner that had been sitting there for 6 days like a held breath. She slid the phone back into her clutch and looked up to find Julian watching her from across the room, mid-conversation, his expression unreadable in the low light. He hadn't approached her yet tonight. She wasn't sure if that was mercy or timing. A server passed with a tray of wine, red against white linen, and Julian's hand lifted almost absently to take a glass without breaking his conversation with Marcus. Simone didn't think anything of it. She had no way of knowing that in less than an hour, that same glass, or one very much like it, would end up on her blazer instead of in his hand. The toast started innocently enough, the reunion committee chair tapping a fork against a glass, asking everyone to raise something in honor of 20 years since we walked these floors as kids. Simone lifted her water glass along with the rest of the room, grateful for something to hold that wasn't her phone. Julian found her before the applause finished. "Simone Wynne." He said her name like an announcement, loud enough that the small cluster around the dessert table turned. "Been a while." "Julian." "You look," he paused, eyes moving over the cream blazer she'd chosen carefully that morning, over the modest clutch, the flats instead of heels because she'd known she'd be on her feet inspecting corners of the room all night if she got the chance. "You look like you're doing okay for yourself." "I am." Still with the what was it, the building stuff. He turned slightly, playing to the small audience that had gathered without quite meaning to, the way a crowd gathers around any argument in progress. "Structural engineering, right? Big money in that these days." "It pays the bills." "Does it, though?" His smile didn't change, but something under it did, an old current she recognized, the one that used to surface at dinner parties when he'd introduce her work like a punchline. "Because last I heard you were renting that walk-up on Delacroix. Rough winter for the restoration business, I'd imagine. Old buildings, no clients who can actually pay full price." A few people laughed, uncertain, the way people laugh when they're not sure if it's safe not to. "Times are tight for everyone," she said evenly. "Not for everyone." He lifted his wine glass toward her, a mock salute, and that was the moment his elbow caught the edge. Whether by accident or the particular carelessness of a man performing for a room, she'd spend the next several days deciding she didn't care which. The glass tipped. Red wine bloomed down the front of her blazer in a long, uneven stripe, soaking through to the blouse underneath, cold and then warm and then just wet. Julian laughed first, a short bark of a sound, before catching himself into something like an apology that didn't reach his eyes. "Guess that one's ruined. Sorry, least it wasn't the expensive stuff. Wouldn't want to add insult to injury, right? Still broke, still." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Simone stood very still, wine cooling against her ribs, the room's noise pressing in from every side, the band still playing, glasses still clinking somewhere near the bar, a phone already raised at the edge of her vision, its small red recording light steady and patient. She hadn't noticed, until that light caught her eye, that someone nearby had started filming several seconds before the glass ever tipped. Simone was still holding a cocktail napkin against the wine-soaked front of her blazer, more out of habit than any real hope of salvaging the fabric, when the band cut out mid-song. The silence that followed wasn't complete. A glass clinked somewhere. Someone laughed and then stopped. But it was enough to make every head in the ballroom turn toward the small stage where the hotel's general manager stood gripping a cordless microphone like she wasn't entirely sure it was on. Sorry to interrupt, the woman said, her voice crackling once before settling. I know this isn't the venue for it, but I've been asked by the city planning office to make an announcement tonight rather than wait for the formal notice, given the circumstances. Several of you work with the city. Some of you are actually standing in the building in question. A ripple of confused laughter moved through the crowd. Julian's face, Simone noticed without quite meaning to look, had gone very still. As most of you know, the Ashcombe Grand was scheduled for a demolition vote this Friday, the GM continued. That vote was moved up and finalized this afternoon, given the volume of public interest in the building's future. Denise Acaffer, near the bar, had gone quiet in a way that suggested she already knew where this was headed. The city planning board has voted to reject the demolition proposal, the GM said, in favor of a full restoration bid submitted 6 days ago. The room didn't react all at once. It reacted the way a held breath does, a beat too late, and then all together. The winning bid, the GM continued, glancing down at a printed card someone had clearly handed her minutes earlier, was submitted by Wynn Preservation Group. Structural survey and restoration plans were completed personally by the firm's principal engineer, who I understand is actually here with us tonight. Simone felt the cocktail napkin go still in her hand. She hadn't planned this. She hadn't even known the announcement was coming tonight, hadn't touched her phone in the last 20 minutes, hadn't imagined the vote could move up by 3 full days without so much as an email. But there it was, spoken aloud into a microphone in the exact ballroom her firm had just saved, in front of 70-some classmates who were now turning, one by one, faces catching up to names. Julian turned last. His eyes found her across the room, the wine-stained blazer, the napkin still pressed flat against her ribs, the same woman he'd called broke less than 10 minutes earlier, and something moved behind his expression that wasn't quite recognition and wasn't quite dread, but was already becoming both. Wynn, he said, quiet enough that only the people closest to him could hear it. That's... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The room was already finishing it for him. The GM stepped off the small stage, microphone still faintly humming with feedback, and for a moment nobody in the ballroom moved at all. Then the room did what rooms do when they realize they've witnessed something without understanding it yet. It turned inward, dozens of small private conversations blooming at once, heads leaning together, phones lifting not to record now but to search. Wynn Preservation Group, someone near the bar said, testing the name like a language they half remembered. Isn't that the firm that redid the old Kessler building downtown? My cousin worked on that crew. That took 2 years. I thought that project cost more than the building was worth. It made the building worth more than the cost. That was the whole point. Denise Acaffer hadn't moved from her spot near the dessert table, and when Simone's gaze crossed hers, there was no surprise in it at all, only something quieter, almost like relief. You surveyed it yourself, Denise said, not quite a question. The structural report, that was you. 6 weeks of it, Simone said, most of it after hours. You never said anything. You didn't ask. It wasn't cruelty in her voice, just fact, and Denise seemed to accept it as such, nodding slowly before turning to intercept Marcus Webb, who was already pulling his phone from his jacket pocket with the particular urgency of a man calculating what this meant for his own cruise. The wine stain on Simone's blazer had gone tacky at the edges, cool and unpleasant against her skin, but she found she'd stopped thinking about it. Around her, the room was rearranging itself in real time. The same 72 classmates who'd laughed at Julian's joke minutes earlier now recalculating, faces shifting through confusion into something more careful. A woman she barely remembered from freshman biology touched her arm gently. "Wait, you're the win from the article in the Preservation Quarterly." "My sister sent me that piece months ago. I didn't put it together." "It's not a common name," Simone said, "but I don't advertise much." "Clearly." Across the room, Julian stood frozen near the stage steps, a knot of his old lobbying targets now forming without him: Denise, Marcus, two others from the planning board's periphery, all trading the same low, urgent murmur, all instinctively angling their bodies slightly away from him. It wasn't hostility. It was something worse, in its way, irrelevance, arriving all at once, the sudden understanding that whatever conversations he'd been steering all night no longer mattered. Simone didn't approach him. She didn't need to. She caught, instead, the exact moment Avani's hand found his sleeve, her expression asking a question he clearly did not yet have an answer for, and the exact moment his phone, buried in his jacket pocket, began to ring. Julian answered the phone in the hallway outside the ballroom, one hand pressed flat against his ear to block out the noise, though the noise wasn't really the problem. "Tell me that wasn't real," he said, before Marcus Webb had even finished saying hello. "It's real. I just pulled the filing on my phone." Marcus's voice had the flat, careful tone of a man delivering bad news he didn't want blamed for. "Win Preservation Group. Full restoration bid. City approved this afternoon. Your demolition contract's dead, Julian. It's not under review, it's dead." The hallway was cooler than the ballroom, the carpet thinner, and Julian found himself staring at a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall as though it might offer something useful. "The numbers don't work for a restoration bid. I ran this. Old wiring, water damage, that marble crack in the east wall alone would cost." "Apparently somebody already surveyed all of that, 6 weeks ago." Marcus paused. "You know who did the structural report, right?" Julian didn't answer. "Her name's on the filing, Julian. Same person you just..." Marcus stopped himself, and the unfinished sentence sat there anyway, doing its work. He hung up without saying goodbye, which wasn't like him, and Julian stood alone in the hallway doing math he already knew the answer to. 9 million owed. 2 lenders with active default notices. 1 demolition contract that had been the only clean path out of both, and that path had just closed with the particular finality of a door built to withstand exactly this kind of pressure. He thought, briefly and uselessly, of arguing the decision, appealing to the board, calling in whatever favors Denise Acaffer might still owe him, finding some clause in some contract that let him salvage a fraction of the fee. He ran through it the way he'd run through every deal that had ever gone sideways, searching for the angle, the workaround, the version of events where he still came out ahead. There wasn't one. Not this time. The bid had beaten his on merit, on timeline, on a structural report more thorough than anything his own team had bothered producing, and no amount of charm applied to a planning board after the vote was going to change a decision already filed with the city. Avani found him there, her heels quiet on the carpet, her face asking the question before her voice did. "Julian, what happened in there?" He didn't answer right away. He was still working out, with the particular clarity that arrives only after it's too late to use it, that he had spent the better part of the evening insulting the one person in that ballroom who could have told him, weeks ago, exactly how bad his numbers really were, if he'd ever once thought to ask her anything at all. The ballroom emptied slowly, then all at once, the way rooms do, a few stragglers by the coat check, a valet stacking chairs against the far wall, the band packing instruments into cases that had seen better decades. Julian and Avani had left over an hour earlier, her hand at his elbow, guiding him toward the door with the careful patience of someone steering a man who'd stopped trusting his own footing. Simone stayed. She told the last of the catering staff she'd lock up behind them, and the hotel's night manager, recognizing her now from the filing photo everyone had spent the evening passing around, didn't argue. Alone, the ballroom sounded different. The string light still glowed faintly along the ceiling beams, and somewhere above her, the chandelier's 3 dead bulbs sat dark among the working ones, waiting for a crew that would arrive in exactly 9 days to replace them. The water stain on the ceiling was invisible in this light, the way it had been invisible the night of prom, the way most damage is invisible until someone bothers to look for it. She set her clutch down on a folded linen tablecloth and stood in the center of the parquet floor, wine-stained blazer draped over a chair, blouse still faintly cool where the stain had dried. There was no music. She danced anyway, slow, unhurried, 1 turn and then a second, her flats quiet against the same floor where a trumpet player had once missed a note, and a boy who loved her imperfectly had told her that buildings were a hobby. The floor held, it always had. She didn't think about Julian while she danced. She thought about joists and load calculations, about the 6 weeks of after-hours surveys that had led her back to this exact room, about the strange arithmetic of a life that lets you save the one place you once thought you'd lost along with everything else. The next morning, she signed the restoration papers at a small table in her office, sunlight cutting flat across the page, coffee going cold beside her elbow. Win Preservation Group, principal engineer, effective immediately. It's worth understanding why her bid actually won. Cities don't always choose the cheapest or fastest option. Many now weigh a restoration proposal's long-term value against a demolition bid's short-term payout, factoring in heritage tax credits, tourism revenue, and preserved union labor. A well-documented structural survey, showing a building is salvageable rather than merely old, can outcompete a demolition contract even when the demolition bid looks financially safer on paper. Simone didn't win by being wealthier than Julian. She won by doing the quiet, unglamorous work of actually inspecting what everyone else had already written off, proof that due diligence, more often than revenge, is what truly settles old scores.